Good morning, and welcome to our state's 4-year Centennial commemoration of World War I. This war changed the world. It changed North Carolina and North Carolinians, nearly 90,000 of whom joined the military to make the world safe for democracy, as President Woodrow Wilson explained to the American people. Over the next 4 years, the North Carolina Department of Cultural Resources will coordinate statewide activities to remember the great sacrifice and service of so many of our grandparents and great-grandparents who did their duty, whether they were in the trenches of Europe, serving as nurses along the front lines, or turning out airplane propellers in High Point, or artillery shells here in Raleigh. During the next 4 years, my department will sponsor exhibits and programs in our museums and sites, sponsor a major exhibit at the State Fairgrounds, which was a tank training ground during the war, and create a greater array of online resources for those interested in knowing more about the state during this pivotal period. At this time, I'm honored to present to you someone I admire and respect very much. Since his very first day in office, he has worked tirelessly for veterans, for the military, and for their families, with new initiatives to help them. I am so proud of this. He is himself the grandson of a World War I veteran. Ladies and gentlemen, the 74th Governor of the state of North Carolina, the Honorable Pat McCrory.
Thank you very much. Thank you. In November of 1917, a young man in his 20s volunteered for the Army from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His first orders were to go to a small town called Charlotte, North Carolina, to train. And in November of 1917, in a very, very cold winter at that time period in North Carolina, he stood in line waiting to get his orders. And then finally, after waiting an hour in line, he finally got to the front where the sergeant said, "What's your name?" He said, "My name's Walter McCrory." He said, "Walter, what do you do?" He said, "I'm a pharmacist." Well, the Army sergeant did not know how to spell pharmacist, so we put down farmer. And he said, "Mr. McCrory, you're going to be in charge of the horses at Camp Green during your training. And if you ever have been to Charlotte, there's a road called Remount Road off of Wilkinson Boulevard. That was exactly where Camp Green was located. And on one side of Remount Road is where you remounted your horses." So that's what he did during his training at Camp Green in Charlotte, North Carolina, in 1917, early 1918. He then went over to France, and it changed him for a lifetime. Because when he was in his early 90s, I invited him to Charlotte when I was in my early 20s and showed him the monument of the 4th Division at Camp Green. And for one of the first times, he started talking about his experiences in the war. As you know, if you have a father or a relative who's fought in any type of war, they tend to be very quiet about it because they've seen things we can't imagine, and they only can describe it to people who have been through that circumstance. But he started saying this to me, and this is why I'm telling this, especially the young people in this audience. He said, "Pat, let me tell you how tough it was." He said, "If you were in the first wave during a battle coming out of the trenches, when the whistle blew and you had to come and lift your head up and charge 20, 30, 40 yards through barbed wire and shelling, every person who was in the first wave knew that they most likely would never see their spouses or their parents or their children or their brothers or sisters or friends again." He said they had a 100% chance of not surviving. They would be gone within seconds. This was a very, very cruel war. Modern weapons, old tactics. Literally millions of people died in this world war within a very small square mile of area in Europe, primarily France, outside of Paris. And it was tragic deaths. It was a tragic war. But these men joined because they believed they were going to be in the war to end all world wars. And that's why my grandfather joined. He once told me the story when coming out of a trench, he heard someone yell McCrory as bullets were flying. He turned around to look to see who yelled his name behind him. And as he turned his face, a bullet went by and nicked his ear. He said, if I would not have turned, that bullet would have hit me square in the face. He never found out who yelled his name. To the day of his last breath, he firmly believed God called his name. And he always said to me, and he said to my father, something special watching over our family. And you have a responsibility, fulfill that responsibility. Because of that, the day I was sworn in this chamber as governor on January the 5th of last year, I took my grandfather's battle medal, and it's been hanging in the office, governor's office, since day one. So I'll never forget my granddad, and knowing the God that is looking over all of us and giving those men who had tremendous courage, knowing that they were going to die and sacrifice for world peace. And that's why they were fighting a world war, was for world peace. Now, as governor of North Carolina now, many years later, I'm proud to say that North Carolina was very, very active in volunteers coming to this war. In fact, North Carolina sent 86,457 soldiers overseas to fight for the United States. You hear that number? 86,000. In only 5 months of combat. Because we came to the war very late. The United States suffered over 275,000 casualties, including 54,000 combat deaths. North Carolina lost 833 men, and over 3,600 men were wounded in battle. Another little-known fact is over 1,500 soldiers died of disease while serving in the Army, mostly here in North Carolina. Most of those deaths actually occurred in one of the worst winters this state has ever seen, and most of them died at Camp Green in Charlotte. Literally, they were carrying caskets out by the dozens each day. So many men did not even make it to battle, and many nurses also died, and their grave markers list that in Charlotte as we speak. President Woodrow Wilson, a Southern Democrat, peppered his administration with North Carolinians during this process. NNO publisher Joseph Daniels became Secretary of the Navy. Journalist Walter Hines Page served as ambassador to England. And David Houston, a North Carolina native, served as Secretary of Agriculture. We had many civilian heroes during that time. Angus MacLean, Walter Clark, who was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Madam Justice. We had military heroes in Robert Blackwell, which has been mentioned. William B.C. Lee, the father of the airborne, was born in Dunn in 1895. Aviator Giffen Rockwell was among 4 North Carolinians who flew for France, who went earlier, before we joined the war, and flew for France in World War I. And many, many others. Madeline Battle Hancock, the most decorated nurse to serve with Allied forces in World War I, grew up in Asheville. She was often close to the battlefront and survived artillery fire and gassing. Now, North Carolina was also impacted by training camps that were settled in North Carolina in 1917 and 1918. I've mentioned Camp Green, which was a 2,300-acre military training facility in which over 60,000 soldiers had poured into that camp. In fact, that's one of the major reasons for Charlotte's growth was the short tenure of Camp Green, because many soldiers ended up coming back after the war because they loved North Carolina so much. And again, many of them never made it out of North Carolina. That camp was closed right after the war in June of 1919. Fort Bragg, which still has such a tremendous impact on North Carolina, our nation, and our military, was authorized in August of 1918 as Camp Gray, a training center for artillery. Initially, the base was designed to support Camp Green, an infantry training center in Charlotte. Upon completion in 1921, the site was named for North Carolina native and Confederate General Braxton Bragg. Camp Polk in Raleigh, right here in Raleigh, was a tank training facility established in September 1918 as part of the mobilization effort for World War I. The installation, of course, was named for William Polk, Revolutionary War colonel and prominent Raleigh residents. The tank training took place in the area near the state fairgrounds, while barracks and other facilities were maintained along Hillsborough Street near North Carolina State University. There's a lot of history here in Raleigh from World War I, and it also had a tremendous impact on the growth of Raleigh and our state. Hot Springs in Madison County was home to a prisoner of war camp. In 1917, the hotel and grounds at Hot Springs in Madison County were leased to the federal government. An internment camp was set up for German merchant sailors captured in U.S. waters when war was declared. This was a tough, tough war. And it continues to even impact us today as you look at what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. Some of the results of that war are still having an impact on generations, not only today, but generations to come. And sadly, we're still seeing death and destruction. And we're also seeing heroism, like we saw from many North Carolinians who took that long boat ride to France, from right here from North Carolina. My granddad later, after all his horses were shelled to death in one battle outside of Verdun in Paris, literally all of his horses were killed. Horses. Modern machinery, but they were still using horses. That was the uniqueness of this war. After his horses were all shelled and killed, they made him a medic because of his chemistry background. And so his job was to help save lives. He gave me his Red Cross patch, which I see several of the people who are wearing the uniforms. I see one right here with a Red Cross patch, and he gave that to me, and he sent it to me with a note, and he said, "Pat, if you smell this patch, you'll smell the stench of war." I thank the men and women, not only in World War I, but the wars before that and the wars after that, for fighting for our freedom and fighting for peace, and having the courage to do that. And we should never forget, and we should always teach the next generation that our freedom, that our legislators and myself and all of us get to enjoy, despite the warts in that democracy and process, it's the best there is in the world. And it's because of these men and women. And I'd like to thank all of you and the leaders for help organizing this. Secretary Klutz, thank you for that team, and to our Adjutant General, and to all involved. It's just fantastic that we're here in a building that was built in 1841, and you've got to assume that there were some people who sat here, whether it be in the audience or here in the House chambers, may have well lost their lives and never returned. May God bless their souls, and may we always remember them. May God continue to bless our great state of North Carolina. Thank you very much.